Hi everyone, Adam Gorton here. My edX username is AGbarcelona. My GitHub is the same. This was recorded on the 20th of January 2026. And the date of the attack in question was April 2025. And that attack was the Marks and Spencer's scattered spider attack. So why did I choose this attack? Well, Marks and Spencer's is a UK icon. I'm from the UK. It was founded in the city that I went to university in. So, it holds a deep kind of place in people from the UK's hearts, essentially. But more importantly, it was the multifaceted nature of the attack that kind of took my interest. It's a layered approach to the attack, yet the entry point, as we'll see, was via essentially human error. So one of the hardest vulnerabilities to protect against. How do we relate to CS50, social engineering, MFA, passwords and hashing, brute force attacks, encryption, malware? So hopefully it gives quite a few or an overview of quite a bit of the course that we covered essentially. So what went wrong and what tech was involved? Well, firstly, the point of entry was social engineering, which is a psychological method used to manipulate or influence a person or a victim into gaining access to sensitive data or systems, right? So in this case, the adversaries, a group called Scattered Spider, use a technique known as phishing or voice phishing, whereby they called M&S's third-party help desk and posed as members of M&S's internal IT team. They then convinced the staff that they were, in fact, legitimate members of that team, and they managed to trick the help desk employees into resetting the M&S team members' passwords, whom they were impersonating, and really importantly, registering a new MFA device, or multiple new MFA devices, which were the adversaries' phones. Okay. Now that part was vital, right? Because as we know, MFA is a technology used to provide extra protection from attacks such as brute force or dictionary attacks. So the MFA combines a password with another factor, right? And it can be a knowledge factor, a possession factor, or an inherence factor. So the adversary would have to have all these factors to gain access to the system. M&S had already invested in this MFA technology. Every employee had a secondary factor, right, which is the MFA token on their registered device. So without being able to get their devices, those new devices registered, the adversary's devices registered, and therefore the MFA tokens, they wouldn't simply have access to M&S's environment. What was the result? It was that the adversaries now had valid usernames, fresh passwords, and valid MFA tokens on their own device to then access M&S's system, and it all looked completely legitimate and kind of a clean, legitimate logon. So it didn't arise any suspicions. Then, to remain undetected, they used quite a clever technique where they refrained from using malware at this stage, even though they're in their environment. So they avoided detection from antivirus software, and they instead used legitimate kind of remote management applications like TeamViewer, which are already in use by the M&S internal teams, right? And therefore, the adversaries avoided detection as their behavior, wasn't suspicious. Then, as they could move through the environment, without detection, what they did is they went for the Active Directory. They went and stole a file called the NTDS file, which is essentially the database that has all the usernames on of all the employees, as well as a hash version of all the passwords of those employees. Right? They moved that NTDS file into their own high-powered servers, which then enabled the next part of their attack while avoiding detection, which was essentially to do a simple brute force attack. So they used those high-powered servers and ran millions, billions of password guesses per second against those hashes. And what they knew is that they didn't need to crack all the passwords, right? They just needed one high-level admin's password to gain domain admin's rights and therefore full access to M&S's corporate network. According to some reports that I read online, M&S did use a one-way hash function, which was based on the MD4 algorithm. I think it's called NTLM for its internal domain passwords, which, as we've learned, that kind of means, or it does mean, while you can turn a password into a hash, you can't mathematically reverse the process. And so, you can't turn the hash into the password, essentially. But there was a vulnerability on this side because the passwords weren't salted, so it just meant that two identical passwords would have the same identical hash keys, making it a lower barrier entry for the adversaries in this kind of brute force attack that they were doing. So once they had this domain access, Scatter Spider then were able to finally deploy the malware, which is in the Dragon Force ransomware. And they did this at one of the most kind of damaging ways possible, because instead of encrypting one file or one laptop, they attacked the hypervisor layer, which essentially is a software layer that splits physical servers into hundreds of virtual machines. And those virtual machines then run whole sections of a company's infrastructure. So M&S's environment, whole sections of the M&S's environment were then affected because they chose to attack this hypervisor layer. So things like the website went down, payment systems went down, logistics systems went down. There were stories of them using pen and paper to track stock and shipments. But what did it mean for the company from a monetary standpoint? Well, huge impact, right? A £300 million operating loss for the year and a £750 million wipe off their stock market value, right? So the bottom line is that these attacks can be absolutely severe and potentially crippling for companies. So we can't afford to ignore the risks of them. So recommendations. Firstly, to address the social engineering aspect, it might be one of the most difficult things to counter as a company, but one way to reduce the risk is to do regular employee training so that they can spot the signs as early as possible and hopefully reduce that kind of attack surface. And then one thing that's really relevant to this case in particular is to essentially to make sure that any companies that have access to your environment, any third parties, are trained and audited regularly up to the same standard as your internal employees, right? Secondly, kind of the second kind of main section is M&S could have increased their MFA process. So they could have used either hardware security keys like YubiKeys, where they're kind of standalone devices which the user or the adversary needs to physically possess to access the system, or perhaps and something we spoke about in the course is something that we'll see more often. They could have adopted passkeys, which are automatically generated passwords that leverage cryptography, which we spoke a lot about in the course. And they're device dependent, so only your specific device will be able to log into a system or website that you want to access. And both would have helped M&S because the adversaries would have had no access to the physical devices of the M&S employees, essentially, or who they're trying to impersonate. More robust permissions and policies certainly would have helped as well. So new MFA devices could have only been approved if they came from known corporate IP address, or potentially clean devices, pre-approved devices. Things like just-in-time policies for admin rights could have helped as well, which means that no account would have permanent admin rights, and therefore Scattered Spider would not have been able to had admin access to the environment, so it would have severely kind of limited the scope of the attack. Segmentation of M&S's environment would have helped as well, as it means that adversaries will potentially be stuck in one silo of M&S's environment. Although, as the world is changing, the world of AI agents is kind of coming in, segmentation as a means of defense might become less effective, as the agents will potentially be granted permission to multiple different systems within a company's environment, right? Then lastly, immutable backup. So this is one way to recover your data without having to pay a ransom, because it means that your data can't be deleted or encrypted. So having that in place would have had some impact on the kind of far back end as well. What's the conclusion here? Well, the conclusion is there's no silver bullets in cybersecurity. There's always going to be vulnerabilities, especially because there's humans in the process, right? So it doesn't matter how much you spend on these tools. The only way the best approach is a multi-layered one, including a mix of software tools, hardware tools, employee education, backups, and more, right? To reduce that risk and increase that resilience. Thanks.